Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her animals. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. This is a strange setup, I realize. The book of Proverbs is offering this image of wisdom as someone who's throwing a big party in a big house. Slaughtering animals, that may sound a little grim, but it is intended to imply that a feast is being prepared. Normal people in ancient times wouldn't have eaten meat except on very special occasions, so this is a big deal. She has sent out her servant girls. She calls from the highest places in the town, "You that are simple, turn in here." This is an interesting approach to getting someone's attention. Send out some servants, then call down to the crowd, "Hey you, bunch of dummies, how about some wine?" Not exactly winning friends and influencing people, unless you really happen to want some wine. To those without sense, she says, "Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the way of insight." Again, Lady Wisdom, as this character is called, is inviting people to enjoy the fruits of wisdom, the fruits of maturity, of insight. Step right up and wise right up. But in the next few lines, this whole approach to becoming wise gets really thrown out the window. Whoever corrects a scoffer wins abuse. Whoever rebukes the wicked gets hurt. A scoffer who is rebuked will only hate you. The wise, when rebuked, will love you. Give instruction to the wise, and they will become wiser still. Teach the righteous, and they will gain in learning. The scoffers will not listen. In fact, get ready for an earful from them. If you speak truthfully to the wise, however, they will love you for it. Which suggests to me that even if you throw that banquet for the simple and the not so wise, they're not coming. Does this mean that you have to start off as wise to be wise? Where does that circle of logic end? Well, wisdom itself is a strange concept. It's elusive. Wisdom suggests that there is a way of thinking and a way of reacting to the world that is better than other ways. But strangely, if you try to write it down, it doesn't seem to work out that way. There are many lists of wise sayings, like the book of Proverbs, but those are not enough to make you wise because you need to know how to apply them, how to use those ideas in one situation versus another. Wisdom is in many ways the skill that underlies the knowledge. Knowing what to do in the moment rather than just memorizing a bunch of rules. It's like playing sports. Memorizing the rule book doesn't make you suddenly a great player. The underlying task is more important than focusing on that framework. And yet, so much time can be spent focusing on those details, those bits of minutia, the fun of the sport can be lost. So what does that mean for how we go about our lives? Are we just surrounded by rules to help make everyone better? To help us find the joys and to navigate the challenge of living? Do we need the rules or do we need something else? Well, today we are going to look at another day in history. On this day, a certain man was said to be born. Said to be, it's a guess, actually. No one precisely knows when this man was born, but his birthday is celebrated by millions. And that day is December 8th, specifically in the year 400 BCE, give or take. That day, Siddhartha Gautama was born. He went by many different names and is known by many different names. Most of them are terribly hard for me to pronounce. The one name best known throughout the world is more of his title, really, representing the achievement of his life, achieving enlightenment. And his name, or title, is the Buddha. There are many legends about the life of the Buddha. Some say he was a nobleman, born to a life of privilege and luxury, a member of a high caste, meaning a high station in life within the society of his country, thought to be somewhere in what is now modern-day Nepal. But he gives all that up. He gives up all of that easy living. He gave it up to become an ascetic, a wandering holy man who was trying to understand and to overcome human suffering. Young Siddhartha was said to have led a sheltered life. His father wanted to protect him from the knowledge of suffering in the world. So he kept his son in the palace. He didn't teach him even about the religion of the time. The man feared that his son would become an ascetic in response to all of that suffering in the world, and his father was correct in that assessment. Well, the religion of this time in this place would have been some form of Hinduism, with its cycle of life, death, and rebirth known as reincarnation. In this system, you progress up or down the ladder of physical incarnations from animal to human and perhaps becoming divine, maybe even backsliding. The ultimate goal is to reach nirvana, a state of consciousness and existence of ultimate freedom and happiness. Well, one day, Siddhartha left the palace. He traveled by chariot and went out into the world. The journey would become known as the Four Sights because he would see four things that would reveal to him the suffering that was in the world. And the first sight was that of an old man. Siddhartha had never seen someone quite so elderly, so he turns to the charioteer named Channa and asks him about it. Channa explained that aging happens to all human beings and creatures of the world alike. The second sight was of a man suffering from some disease. Channa explained that disease and pain were common to all living beings. The third sight was of a dead body, and again, Channa had to explain that death would come to all who lived. Now, the fourth sight was of an ascetic, a holy man who had dedicated himself to finding the cause of all the suffering in the world. Seeing this man, Siddhartha had a feeling of hope, and as his father predicted, he rejected his life of privilege and instead turned to the ascetic's life to ascertain the source of suffering. As an ascetic, Siddhartha would follow a life of strict discipline and abstention, restricting his eating and his drinking and spending many long hours in the practice of meditation. He did this as a way of contemplating the nature of suffering. In one sense, it was him suffering, and another, it was his turning his attention to the nature of suffering. He had gone from a life in which every need he had was taken care of, to one in which he denied even his most own basic needs. He was starving himself on the pathway of denial, and his hope was that by doing so, he would find the right way. And in a sense, this worked. Not because he achieved enlightenment by starving himself to death, but because he realized that he was going about it all the wrong way. Just as you would not discover the truth about life by indulging your every whim, every vice, you would not discover the truth by restricting your every impulse and denying even the most life-saving of actions. So what should you do? Follow the so-called middle pathway between these extremes. This would become the eightfold path in Buddhism, which is fairly involved even with its only 8 points. So I will try to simplify. You need to have the right sense of morals, such as right speech and right action. Don't lie, don't gossip, don't kill, don't harm any other creatures. You need to have the right mindset, such as through meditation and avoiding unwelcome ways of thinking or being. And lastly, you have to have the right insights, including the right viewpoint about life and the right resolve when it comes to acting along this new path. Now that right insight could be considered wisdom like Lady Wisdom calling down to the people in the streets. But do they listen? Would they recognize wisdom even if it was shouted down from the rooftops? This is a fundamental challenge of most religious traditions. Thinking you have the answers to so many questions, if only people would bother to listen, to change, to act. But will they do that? Buddhism is in some ways simple in its practices, and in many respects it is terribly complicated with its subtleties. As I was going over materials for this week, I was daunted by the many points of nuance, the brain-bending sayings and teachings. But you're not supposed to just get these lessons. You are supposed to ponder their meaning through study and meditation across a lifetime. It's not just an easy-to-read handbook of wisdom that you can just cram in an afternoon or even in a week of sermon research. So when I realized the enormity of this task of trying to boil down Buddhism into a cogent sermon of nearly bearable length, I didn't know initially where to go with it. And then I sat for a while, not exactly meditating, to be honest, but giving it a good hard think. And I decided to look at a particular aspect of Buddhism, one of the very first steps one is expected to take on that road toward enlightenment. And that step is having the right view. One way of describing the right view is to say that our actions have consequences, death is not the end, and our actions and beliefs have consequences after death. Consequences of your actions, that's pretty straightforward. But that observation is still helpful to the average person distracted by the burdens of this life. Then there's the next part. Death is not the end, and our actions and beliefs have consequences after we die. On the surface, there is no difference there from the message one would receive in one of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. You live your life, and then how you lived has an impact on what happens next. The next part is the big question. It is a major difference between the religions of those Abrahamic traditions and those of South Asia, such as Hinduism and Buddhism and others. One typically has a notion of an afterlife, whatever that might entail, while the other is a pattern of birth, death, and rebirth, two different ways of thinking about what comes next. In one, you're trying to achieve a state of paradise after living one life in this world. And in the other, you are cycling through different lives, different states of being. Now, I'm vastly simplifying both traditions, but arguably, this is a comparison of one life leading to one afterlife, and many lives over a cycle of life, death, and rebirth. In both systems, you are rewarded or punished by your behavior. Some Protestants might argue with that conclusion. They would say that your eternal fate was set before you were born through the notion of predestination. We might add that as a third category. But in each of these categories, that is a particular view. You have to choose one. You live and then you die, or you live and you die over and over again. In one sense, you have to accept one of those ways of thinking in order to begin the overall thought project. But what happens if you don't do that? What would be the right view? If you don't believe in an afterlife, what does it mean to be a Christian or Muslim or a Jew? Or if you don't believe in reincarnation, what would it mean to be a Hindu or a Buddhist? Because many people have doubts. They have doubts about the teachings of salvation in religion because it requires you to take a very enormous leap of faith towards something. When the Buddha taught that he re-experienced his many lives that he had gone through in the cycle of reincarnation, you have to accept that or not. When John Calvin and Martin Luther taught that you are saved by faith and faith alone, and that's the only thing that matters, you have to accept that or not. When a Catholic priest or a Muslim imam teaches that you have to do certain things or not do other things in order to make your way into paradise, you have to accept that or not. But let's place that all aside for a moment. It's a big ask. Let's place aside the idea of reincarnation or any kind of afterlife or any other suppositions about one's ultimate destination. Because if we step back from those questions, those thorny questions that do not lend themselves to easy answers, backed up with any certainty at least, a question still remains. And that question is no longer how to live this life in order to achieve some theological goal. The question is how to live this life in the best way possible. The best way for ourselves, the best way for others, the best way to achieve happiness or contentment or fulfillment, the best way to be in the here and now. How might we answer that question while we momentarily park questions about eternity? Well, in Buddhism, there's a concept called maitri, sometimes referred to as metta, two T's. It means benevolence, goodwill, or loving kindness. It is a central idea represented by the Metta Sutra, where sutra essentially means scripture. In the Metta Sutra, one hears, "May all beings be happy and secure, may they be happy-minded. Let none deceive another, nor despise any person, whatever in any place. In anger or ill will, let them not wish any suffering to each other. Just as a mother would protect her only child at the risk of her own life, even so, let him cultivate a boundless heart towards all things. This notion of loving kindness is similar to the expectations of love at the heart of Christianity and also at the heart of Judaism and Islam. There's also a lot more to Buddhism than just this focus on benevolence. And some would also argue that there's a lot more to Christianity and the others than some call to love. My goal in this sermon is not to get anyone to choose one religious tradition versus another. It is not to dismiss the notion of an afterlife in favor of something else, or even to make any claims about the afterlife. Buddhism is said to be called the middle way, a pathway to navigate between self-indulgence and self-denial, between the life of the hedonist seeking pleasure and the life of the ascetic seeking enlightenment. The Buddha taught that neither of these two extremes of behavior were the correct way forward. And I would agree with that assessment. I'm sure the Buddha is terribly pleased with my vote of confidence. The goal for my words on this particular occasion is not to offer any degree of certainty on matters that are truly questions of faith rather than belief. We can work on those another time. My purpose for your consideration is to follow some helpful words about wisdom and this life. When Lady Wisdom called to the people to come in and feast, her teachings were not always simple instructions to listen to this person or that prophet, to this piece of scripture or any particular school of thinking. Sometimes wisdom took the form of straightforward, pragmatic advice. No complicated doctrine, no iron-bound traditions, no hard-to-navigate theologies. Keep it simple, sunshine, as the saying goes. Many people in this day and age do not turn to religion for any of their answers. They have become alienated from the religious traditions of their youth, or they were never brought up in any religious tradition at all. For these folks, there are reasons to distrust religion: scandalous behavior and inexcusable abuse, narrow-minded thinking about social values, open hypocrisy about the supposedly central religious teachings. Strict morality might be expected unless, of course, you happen to be able to gain some political advantage in the world. And so people have diminished confidence in the wisdom that is being called down from the rooftops. All of this negativity about religion has led to significant declining interest in being a part of religious community. Any religious community, not just the bad actors, not just the ones in the headlines, not just the ones on the police blotters. Religion itself has become suspect, and so those unaffiliated with any faith tradition grow in numbers while religious numbers decline. One of the ways to help create, or rebuild at least, confidence in religious communities, and of any tradition really, is to get back to basics. That is what you're supposed to do in golf or tennis or any sport. Get back to the basics. Save all of that fancy stuff for later. Focus on what is central. And I think the basics are staring right at us. Loving kindness, benevolence and goodwill, love one's neighbor. But what about loving God in the Christian formulation? What about that? Well, I would argue that if you are loving your neighbor, are you not one step closer to loving God? And if you never quite get there as a matter of belief, if you continue to harbor some doubts, I'm pretty sure that God would still be happy with the general increase of the loving kindness in this world. I cannot speak for Buddha. Honestly, I can't speak for God either, but even though it sounds like that some Sundays. But anyway, if you have no confidence in reincarnation, but go around helping people and being good to one another, it's probably not going to hurt your chances in the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, or to gain access to heaven or paradise, or however you imagine the next step. The Buddha sought to understand the nature of human suffering and to find a way to escape its seemingly endless cycle. Loving kindness may not be the only step in that journey, but it is a step. It is one step towards making others suffer less, and it is one step towards making others, ourselves, suffer less. Being loving and being kind is better than the alternatives. Better for those who receive it, and better for those who are offering it. Loving kindness is its own reward. Amen.